Okay, we're going to have a little discussion about utilizing color in the landscape. So this doesn't have anything to do with color rendering as far as your drawings are concerned, but how you might think about organizing your plants in the landscape. It needs a purpose. It needs to contribute to the overall unification of the gardens and of the landscape. Because color sets your mood. Color is often associated with life. People want the flowers in their garden because of color. It can be calming depending upon the color. It can be exciting. So it can be, I know we always say trigger warning, but it can be a trigger, not in a bad way, but for excitement and involvement and people to go, oh, ooh, I like that in the garden. So we want you to think of all of the parts of the plant. Everything from the flowers, which are really, really obvious. Foliage, probably the next most obvious thing, but look at fruit, look at bark, look at your hardscapes. Everything that we use in the landscape has color to it. So nice fall color is obviously something that turns people, that turns people's heads. They really like those sorts of things. So we definitely want to look at our trees and our shrubs for their fall color. We want to look at our plants for their foliage color. The advantage to foliage over just about anything else is obviously it's going to be there the entire season, which means it lasts longer as a base for other colors than anything else. Flowers are an obvious one. They're probably one of the shortest lived ones, but flowers are an obvious one. Fruit is another great one, especially to try to extend that interest into the winter, where for us, there's really not a lot going on. So here is a very early flowering plant. This is a witch hazel. This one happened to be flowering in February, this particular season. There's that same plant in fall color. So if you can find plants that have multi-season interest, they're great, particularly when you got small gardens. So fall color can create some very nice color combinations. Look at green. Don't ignore green. It's the most common color in a landscape. If you take a look at this picture, look at the number of shades of green there are. There's lots of them. Get used to looking at a lot of different shades of green, and you can really combine those well. But what is color? We know the color wheel. Roy G. Biv, right? Red, orange, yellow, blue, green, indigo, violet. So we know that. I'm not overly concerned with how we get color. You know, the reality is what we see is light reflected off of an object. It absorbs whatever the object is, absorbs every other color except for what we're seeing. So that's light reflected off of an object. I'm not concerned about the science behind that because what we're looking at is how do we combine these things to make people go, ooh, in the landscape. One way to look at things is combining our primary colors, our red, yellow, and blue, with our secondary colors, our orange, green, and violet. And one way to look at some of those things is primary is you don't mix it with another color to get that color. So how do I get orange? I mix red and yellow. How do I get green? I mix yellow and blue. How do I get purple? I mix red and blue. So those are some of the things that you want to look at in terms of remembering primary and secondary. So if you can remember those, combining those colors are great ways to get good color combinations. The challenge is we can never guarantee that what you see and what your client sees are exactly the same thing. So what color is this? When I ask this question, a lot of people give me all kinds of range of colors. The company that invented this particular flower calls it chocolate, meaning brown. Okay, odd brown. Maybe a little bit easier. What color is this? Usually very few arguments that this is a purple or a violet. How about this one? The company that invented this particular plant calls it Salvia Blue Hill. Blue. I'm not sure a 4-year-old would call that blue, but that's what the company calls it. Look at all aspects of color. Look at your furniture, your throw pillows, your pots, the wood, the leaves. Everything in this has some sort of color. Color combinations don't have to be complicated. They can be very, very simple combinations. There's not a lot of color here. So what did we do to try to increase the color? We put the color, that oomph color, on top of those pillars. Flowers and foliage and seed heads combined together. Browns, especially the fall. We think of brown. Here's another way to look at it. If the primary and the secondary doesn't do it for you, then look at cool colors or warm colors. So cool colors are very relaxing, easy on the eye. Those are our blues, our purples, our greens. Our warm colors, sometimes also called our hot colors, are the reds, the yellows, and the oranges. And those tend to be very exciting and very emotional. So that's another way to combine things that makes it seem a little bit more interesting. Don't memorize these. If you buy yourself a color wheel, it will have these definitions on there. And the reason we have these sorts of definitions is because we can go to different shades and different tints and different tones of things. But when we're working with plants, we're not actually adding pigment or subtracting pigment. We're just going to shift to a different cultivar to get a slightly different color variation on that color that we're looking for. So here we have some hot colors or warm colors, whichever term you prefer. Cool colors, your purples. Now, where does pink fall in all of this? And think about how we make pink if you're looking at pigment. You take red and you add white and you get pink. So at its base value, pink is a hot or a warm color. But the reality is, look at these two shades of pink. They're two vastly different shades. So pink actually gets to play on both sides of the fence depending upon the intensity and the value that that color is. So we can have it either hot or cold. This is going to be our blacks, our silvers, our whites, our grays, and it's all for the convenience of the designers. These are great plants for separating other plants that might clash. So if your client says, this is my favorite plant and that is my second favorite plant, and you put those two plants together and no, you don't like them, put a silver or a black or a white in between them so that they're not bouncing color off each other, they're bouncing off of a neutral color. This is an okay pink. It's not a pink that you're necessarily going to write home about. You're just like, it's pink. But what sets that pink apart is the black leaf underneath. So use those colors to set other things apart. This happens to be an Artemisia. It's a highly aggressive plant. It's a pain in the butt sort of plant, but it's a great color for bouncing off of other colors. Maybe the hot and cool thing doesn't do it for you. Maybe the primary secondary thing doesn't do it for you. But you can think monochromatic, analogous, and complementary. So if we go back to that color wheel, Roy G. Biv, monochromatic is basically everything going to be all of one color. So pick your client's favorite color, purple. And everything in there has shades of purple and in their flowers and in their foliage. Analogous are going to be next to each other on that color wheel. So orange is next to both red and yellow. So those are good color combinations. Complementary is going to be across from each other on the color wheel. And that's a little harder to visualize than writing them in a row. So if we go back to our color wheel, you can see that yellow and purple are across from each other. Red and green are across from each other. Blue and orange also across from each other. So those are also ways that we can combine plants that usually tend to get very pleasing results for people. And they're again next to each other on the color wheel. So here's an example of a monochromatic garden. Everything in this garden has either yellow flowers or yellow variegated foliage. Another one done in silver. Now let's start thinking about our pastels. So is this analogous or complementary? We have orange and yellow. Now they're not exactly the orange and yellow that you might think of a base crayon, but they're orange and yellow, so technically that's going to be analogous. What about here? Yellow and purple, complementary. We can do this with annuals, we can do it with perennials, you can do it with the foliage. Doesn't have to be fancy dancy. And again, remember, this is where pink opens you up to a much wider variety of combinations, because pink in various shades will combine with lots and lots of different colors. What is the function of this silver leaf? If you look at all the rest of the flowers, it's basically mostly purple. Yeah, there's kind of a pinky thing thrown in there too. It's almost all purple. That's kind of boring. So what we do is we throw that neutral one in there, and that really sets those other flowers off. There's our obligatory scarlet and gray. Separate plants that clash with your neutral colors, with your silvers, with your blacks, with your whites. You can also separate them with foliage plants. So a plain green goes a really long way to separating other things that might clash. Remember, everything in your landscape has a color and that color can have a function. So look at the color of the pathway here and how that really plays nicely with the purple that's next to it. Pick a color scheme and repeat that down over and over and over again. So this particular garden, at this particular time, this garden is 300 feet long and about 10 or 12 feet deep. So it's huge. So what the designer did here was they picked kind of reds and purples and yellows, and that's what's most active at this time of year when I was visiting this particular garden. And they just repeated that exact same color combination all the way down the length of the garden. Different seasons have different color combinations, but it meant that they didn't have to think of 5,000 different plants. You're just going to use the same plants over and over and over again. Black and white is actually kind of an interesting color combination, so that you can use that as well. Don't go overboard on things, because I look at this and go, wow, there's some really cool plants in there, and then my eyes go, oh, I can't look at that. It's like 1970s horror wallpaper or something like that. They don't have to be complicated. If you're looking at monochromatic, and here's a monochromatic yellow, this is about as simple as it gets, an ornamental grass and a canna. They don't have to be the most complicated things for us to think them very pleasing. They don't have to be the latest and greatest, most expensive plants that nobody has ever heard of before. Cannas and coleus. You can buy that at a box store. Doesn't have to be fancy to be attractive. There's that neutral color again, that black, that can really set off a lot of other colors. Sometimes the angle of viewing is important. So I look at this and I'm like, oh, those are cool, really cool plants, but they're not really interacting with each other because they're separated. But you look at it from a slightly different angle, a little bit closer, and you go, oh, well, that's a really cool, kind of interesting sort of colors. Same thing here. The black and the white, like, that's kind of cool, but they're not really close enough that they're really interacting a whole lot until you zoom in. And then you do get a nice little vignette. So keep in mind, we can view our gardens from lots of different distances. And that's another thing that we often don't think about, is that up-close vignette versus the slightly further back versus the I'm going to sit on my patio and view my yard from a distance. Now think about this one. Do you like the colors that you see here? And then why or why not? Again, monochromatic. Doesn't have to be complicated. Very simple, purple. Go a little bit fancier. You see a couple of other different types of color schemes here. So the reds, the yellows, and the blues. Again, fairly simple. What sets this one up? Because if we look at this at our basic colors, it is green and kind of silvery gray white, if you want to look at that. So a whitish color. What sets this one apart? The red. Notice where the reds are. We got the red in the building. We also brought the red into a Japanese maple, which is a little hidden right there. Blue. We've got blue foliage here. So this color combination is going to last throughout a good portion of the season. What sets this garden? Take a look at what things are in flower. Yes, there's a little bit of a yellow off to the left-hand side, but what sets this garden apart is actually the tan in that round seed head, because otherwise it's purple flowers in the front and two different shades of purple in the back. And those are great flowers, they're great plants, but what makes that is that brown puffball that sets itself apart from everything else. Utilize all aspects of your landscape, because here the blue is what really makes this. And it's not officially a plant, but it is part of the landscape. They can be simple, they can be complicated, but if you start with the simple, you're going to be better off in the long run. Mimicking colors from the hardscape. So the reddish-ish of the walk and the pink-ish of the hydrangeas. Have fun with it. This is one of the things where we can be whimsical, and people just really delight in that. This happens to be a children's garden, but it doesn't mean that you can't do something whimsical for some of your clients. Not every client is going to want something like that. Again, fun, whimsy. The color here is coming from this statue, which is actually made out of Legos. I'm not a huge fan of the blue and the yellow here, but I really appreciate what they've done with these picture frames and how they've incorporated that into the garden, and it presents a lot of interest and something interesting to look at. Looking at your annuals, looking at your fall color, we want to look at all aspects of the landscape. Okay, as always, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to get in touch.